The year was 1872, and Alabama was a land not yet free of its ghosts. The war had ended 7 years before, but for those who walked its cracked roads and breathed its heavy air, the conflict never truly left. The Civil War had torn through the South like a storm of fire and steel, and the years that followed were marked not by healing, but by a slow, festering decay. Entire towns lay in ruin, their buildings scorched and crumbling, their streets littered with the remnants of what once was. The plantations, once symbols of wealth and cruel power, had been gutted, their fields abandoned to weeds, their grand houses collapsing under the weight of silence. Where cotton had once grown in endless white seas, only barren patches of red earth remained, hard as brick and cracked from the relentless sun. Reconstruction had brought new laws, federal soldiers, and the uneasy beginnings of change, but it had not brought peace. In the countryside, bitterness clung to the air like smoke that refused to rise. Former soldiers in ragged gray uniforms wandered the backroads, hollow-eyed and starving, their loyalty to a lost cause written in the scars across their faces. Freed men and women, carrying the weight of newly granted freedom, struggled to survive in a land that often turned hostile against them. The towns that still clung to existence were filled with suspicion, poverty, and whispers of violence. Nights were dark, not just for lack of lanterns, but because fear kept shutters closed and lips sealed. The land itself seemed cursed. Heavy storms would roll across the hills, tearing through crops, flooding roads, and leaving behind an even deeper desolation. When the rains fell, the red soil bled, releasing the faint metallic scent of iron, as if the blood spilled during. The war had seeped into the earth and refused to wash away. Travelers who passed through spoke of the uncanny silence that seemed to hang over the fields, of crows that gathered in great black clouds above abandoned farmhouses, and of wolves that prowled near settlements where once no predators dared approach. It was as though nature itself had turned feral, feeding on the suffering of man. For the people of Alabama, survival was a daily battle. Families patched their roofs with rags and scavenged for food where they could. The wealth that once came from cotton and trade had evaporated, leaving hunger gnawing at bellies. Bread was scarce, corn scarcer still, and most families lived on the edge of starvation. Yet in the midst of this ruin, there were whispers of places where the soil still yielded plenty, where fields remained green against all odds. People spoke of them with awe, but also with unease, as though abundance in such times could not exist without some hidden cost. Superstition thrived in that broken land. In the evenings, elders told stories by the dim light of oil lamps, tales of restless spirits wandering the fields, of blood that cried out from beneath the soil, of cursed farms where the earth itself demanded payment in flesh. Some dismissed these as tales born from grief and fear, but others believed them with unshakable conviction. Faith in the church was strong, but so too was faith in older, darker beliefs whispered from generation to generation. The war had made people desperate, and desperation has always been fertile ground for superstition. It was within this world of ruin and shadow that the farmer lived. His land lay on the outskirts of a small town, a place barely surviving, its church bell rusted silent, its schoolhouse long abandoned. Neighbors passed his farm on occasion, noting the crooked fences, the sagging roof, the eerie quiet that clung to his property. But it was not the decay that drew their eyes. It was the impossible green of his fields, a green that defied the times, a green that seemed to mock the hunger in their bellies. And though they whispered among themselves, though suspicion gnawed at their thoughts, none dared to accuse him openly. For in Alabama in 1872, hunger could silence even the loudest fears, and so the stage was set, the ground prepared for a story that would spread in hushed tones across generations. A story born not just of one man's choices, but of a land still bleeding, a land that seemed to demand something in return for every stalk of corn, every blade of wheat. The earth of Alabama had been fed with blood, and perhaps it had acquired a taste for it. The farmer was a man without history, at least none that survived the erosion of memory. In the town, he was known simply as the man on the edge of the fields, a figure who moved like a shadow between his crops, appearing only when necessity forced him into the company of others. He did not share drink at the tavern, nor raise his voice in the church pews. He was not seen laughing among neighbors or trading stories in the marketplace. His presence was always marked by silence, and that silence clung to him like a second skin. In a world already heavy with grief and hunger, his solitude made him an object of quiet suspicion. It was said he had once been a soldier, though no one knew in which uniform he had fought. Some claimed they saw the faint outline of scars across his hands and jaw, marks that might have been carved by bayonets or musket fire. Others swore they recognized the emptiness in his eyes, the same hollow look carried by men who had stood knee-deep in death, who had seen too much to ever truly return to the living. He never spoke of the war nor of the years before it. When asked, he simply nodded and turned away, as though words were burdens he refused to carry. The farmhouse where he lived stood crooked and weary, its timbers warped by the damp Alabama air, its shutters hanging loose like broken wings. The roof sagged in the middle, patched clumsily with planks that seemed older than the house itself. Inside, the rooms were nearly bare. A wooden table, a bed frame with a mattress thin as paper, a fireplace blackened by countless fires. All signs of a life stripped down to its bones. But the house was not always so empty. Years earlier, there had been a woman, his wife. Her story was remembered only in fragments. Some said she had died of fever, taken suddenly in the night while her husband kept watch with unblinking eyes. Others whispered of madness, that she had wandered into the fields one evening and never returned, her bonnet later found tangled in the stalks. The cruelest rumor suggested she had ended her life by her own hand, unable to endure the suffocating silence of that farm. Whatever the truth, her absence lingered in every corner of the house, in every worn groove of the wooden floor. Neighbors recalled how, after her death, the farmer rarely left his land, how he spoke less and less until words themselves seemed foreign to him. He became a figure of isolation, haunting his property like a specter tethered to the earth. Children dared each other to run up to his fence at dusk, to peer through the crooked posts and catch a glimpse of him moving among the rows. They said he walked with a strange rhythm, stopping often to kneel and press his hands into the soil, whispering as though he were speaking to someone unseen. Adults dismissed these tales as childish fancy, but in their own hearts, they too felt unease. Few dared to knock at his door, and when they did, he opened it only a crack, his pale face half hidden in shadow, his eyes unreadable. There were stories, too, of the nights. A neighbor living closest to his land swore that after midnight, he often saw a faint light drifting among the crops, moving slowly, methodically, as if carried by a hand that searched for something in the dark. Sometimes he heard murmurs carried on the wind, low and deliberate, like prayers spoken to the earth itself. He told others of these visions, but the hunger of the times silenced them. If the farmer's land bore crops when theirs did not, who were they to question the cost? Yet even those who took his grain and thanked him for it spoke his name only in whispers. They saw the loneliness in his stooped shoulders, in the way his head tilted when listening, as though attuned to sounds no one else could hear. He was not just a man living apart from the town. He was a man apart from the living world altogether. His isolation was not a choice, but a condition, a mark branded deep upon him by grief, by war, by whatever secret pact bound him to his land. And in that silence, in that isolation, the first seeds of horror were sown. For solitude has a way of warping the mind, of transforming whispers into voices, of turning grief into devotion. The neighbors thought him strange, perhaps mad, but they did not know the truth. They did not know that the farmer was not alone. For the earth itself was listening, and in his solitude, he had begun to listen back. At first, it seemed nothing more than fortune. In a land where drought had burned the earth into dust and storms had torn what little remained of the crops, the farmer's field stood strangely resilient. His corn rose straight and tall, the stalks thick with life, their tassels shining like gold beneath the summer sun. His wheat swayed in endless ripples, bending only to the will of the wind, not to hunger or decay. While other families scoured the woods for roots and berries, the farmer carried baskets filled with bread, ears of corn fat with kernels, and sacks of grain that seemed almost endless. To some it was a miracle. To others it was an omen. The contrast was too stark to ignore. Neighbors watched their own crops wither, their fields devoured by pests, their soil turning dry and cracked as if cursed. Families prayed in their churches, begging God for mercy, while across the fence line the farmer's land thrived, lush and unyielding. Whispers spread quickly, for people in desperate times are quick to find explanations in the unseen. Some said the farmer had found a spring hidden beneath the soil, a secret well that nourished his fields while theirs died of thirst. Others murmured that perhaps his land had escaped the wrath of God because he lived without pride or excess. But there were darker voices too, those who remembered the stories told by their elders, stories of soil that fed on more than rain, of fields that demanded payment in flesh. Children were the first to speak of oddities. They claimed that when they played near the edge of his land, they felt the air grow heavy, as if the ground itself exhaled beneath their feet. One boy swore he saw the corn move, though no wind stirred, the stalks trembling like living things. Another girl returned pale and shaken after peering between the rows, insisting she saw the farmer on his knees with his hands sunk deep in the earth, his lips moving in a language she did not know. Parents scolded them for speaking lies, yet unease settled in their hearts. They knew that children often glimpse truths adults force themselves to ignore. By midsummer, the unease deepened. A woman fetching water at dusk claimed she saw a light drifting through the farmer's fields, bobbing like a lantern carried by an invisible hand. She heard a low murmur, like a prayer carried on the breeze, but when she strained to listen, the voice became a cry, distant, muffled, and full of pain. She fled, clutching her jug, and swore never to walk that path again. Others, too, reported hearing strange sounds in the night, sounds that did not belong to the living. The bleating of animals when none were present, the moans of men carried. Faintly on the wind, the soft sobbing of children that made the skin crawl. And yet each time dawn came, the farmer's crops grew taller, greener, stronger. The people of the town began to change in how they spoke of him. To his face, they thanked him when he shared his grain, their voices hushed with gratitude, their eyes darting nervously to the ground. Behind his back, they whispered in tones sharp with fear. They began to call his land by names that carried weight: haunted ground, cursed soil, the field of whispers. But hunger makes cowards of men, and as long as his crops filled their bellies, their fear remained chained behind sealed lips. To condemn him, to confront him, would mean to risk starvation. The farmer himself seemed unchanged, at least to those who watched him from afar. He still moved among his rows with the same slow, deliberate pace, still kept his silence when approached in town. Yet those who observed closely swore there was something different in the way he carried himself. His back no longer bent beneath grief, but seemed to hold a quiet strength, as though the earth itself lent him its power. His eyes, once hollow and lost, now glimmered faintly in the moonlight, watching the world with an unsettling calm. It was as if he had found a companion in his solitude, something that whispered back when he spoke to the soil. By harvest time, the fields looked unnatural, their abundance almost mocking the ruin around them. Neighbors stood at the edge of his land and felt both envy and dread. It was then that the first true suspicion took root. For some swore that when the farmer cut his corn, the stalks bled. A dark red liquid seeped from the severed stems, thick and glistening, soaking into the ground. They said the farmer did not recoil but smiled faintly, as though he had seen proof that the pact was sealed. And though none dared to step closer, the rumor spread like wildfire through the starving town. The farmer's crops were not watered by rain, nor nourished by hidden springs. They were fed by something else, something darker, something alive. He first noticed it by accident, on a morning when the sky was the color of ash and the crows refused to land. A hen had broken its neck against the corner of a trough during the night. and when he found it, the blood had already seeped into the furrow that ran beside the chicken yard. The corn along that shallow run had been wilting the day before, leaves curled and pale, but now it stood alert, as if roused from sleep. The stalks held a new shine at the edges, a gloss that did not belong to dew. He crouched, pressed 2 fingers into the damp soil, and lifted them to his face. The scent came first, iron and clay, dry and sweet together. An aroma that brought a tightness to his chest that was not fear. He told himself that any soil might quicken with meat mixed into it, that a dead animal was a kind of fertilizer, that the world worked by exchange and return. Yet the way the leaves trembled when his shadow fell across them made him think of breath, and the way the ground seemed to throb faintly beneath his fingertips made him think of a pulse. After that morning, he began to pay attention to how water behaved on his land. When he poured from the bucket, the ground drank quickly and then rejected it, puddles forming, running away, as if the earth were tired of thin nourishment. But when he rinsed a blade after butchering a chicken, and the rinsing turned pink, the soil took it in like thirst after a long fever. He tried again, this time kneeling at the edge of a row and letting the warm blood fall in a steady ribbon along the furrow. He watched the dark line spread and disappear, watched the surface settle and then rise like a chest, taking a slow breath. At dusk, the plants were a shade deeper, a richer green that seemed to hold the light even as the sun slipped away. He did not pray that night. He sat at the edge of his porch and listened to the field hum like a hive that had learned his name. What began as an experiment became a habit, and habit became a ritual, whose shape revealed itself with uncanny ease. He prepared a bowl in the kitchen, a heavy wooden thing that had belonged to his wife, its rim worn smooth by years of bread making. Into it he bled the necks of chickens, the small throats of rabbits trapped at the edge of the fence, the lamb he had planned to keep for, wool but now carried in his arms like a sleeping child. He worked at night, not because he feared eyes upon him, but because the field seemed to wake under the moon. He would walk between the rows with a lantern cupped in his palm, the flame small and steady, and where the light touched the leaves, a faint shimmer would run along them like a shiver of delight. He poured carefully, spoke softly, and used the same words each time. He promised care, he promised secrecy, he promised more. The wind answered in small movements, and the soil settled around his boots as if approving. The animals were not enough for long. The field grew greedy, or perhaps he did. He paced the aisles between the corn and felt them tighten like corridors in a house that had suddenly learned to breathe. He saw that the first drink revived the plants with astonishing speed, but the second made them swell, and the third made them almost radiant, the tassels laden to the point of bending. Yet after several nights he noticed a plateau, a new limit that left the leaves restless and the stalks creaking as if impatient. He increased the amounts. He slaughtered 2 goats, then 3. He set up a barrel for storage in the cool of the smokehouse, adding salt the way he had once watched a butcher do in the town, stirring with a stick until his shoulders ached. But fresh was what the earth wanted. Fresh and warm, the heat still. In it, he learned that the moment of offering mattered, that the first rush carried something more than nourishment, something that moved from throat to soil with a kind of living current. He began to hear the field at odd hours, the faintest susurration even when the air was still, a speech without words that required the body to interpret it. It spoke through the soles of his feet when he crossed the rows. It spoke through the small hairs along his forearms that lifted when he reached the center of the field, where the growth was thickest. Sometimes he would kneel and press his ear to the ground the way a man listens for an approaching train, and what reached him then was not a single sound but a layered chorus, like water moving through 100 hidden channels. He understood none of it, yet he knew what it meant. It meant hunger. It meant the field knew him and counted on him. He felt chosen, which is another way of saying he felt forgiven. On the nights he faltered, memories returned with the clarity of a cold sky. He saw his wife at the table, the wooden bowl under her hands, the flour lifting like smoke as she pressed and folded, humming some tune too simple to name. He could not form prayers, but he could form promises, and he began to make them. If the earth kept the crows from his corn, he would give more. If the wheat stood when storms bent every other field, he would give more. If the soil held the prints of his knees like a family holds the memory of a lost child, he would give whatever it asked. In the morning, the tracks of his knees remained, filled with moisture as though the ground had kissed them. In the afternoon, the crows wheeled high and then veered away as if struck by an invisible wall. At night, the storm split around his plot, thunder rolling like a boundary set by an old and jealous god. Soon he noticed that the animals had grown strange as well. The calves were heavier in the flank and slow to rise, as if drowsy from some profound meal. The hens laid eggs with shells hard as porcelain, white and perfect, yet the yolks within were too bright, an orange that seemed lit from within. When he carried a bucket of blood across the yard, the dog that had once followed at his heel stopped at the threshold of the field and would not cross, tail low, eyes averted, as though some law had been written there in a language of scent and tremor that no creature could ignore. The dog began to sleep under the house and wake at odd hours, growling without sound, and by the time the moon was a thin coin in the sky, the dog had wandered off and never returned. It was the first departure that felt like a warning, but warnings cannot compete with harvest. By late summer, the yield surpassed any he had seen, even in the old years before the war, when the county had called itself blessed. He ran his hands over the heavy heads of wheat and felt an intimacy that made him blush even though no one was there to see it. He ate bread that tasted like a memory of a feast and drank water from the pump that held a sweetness he had not known was possible. Sleep came easily and ended quickly, for he woke with the impatience of a lover on the edge of confession. He told himself that what he was doing was part of the order of the world. All things feed all things. He only hastened the exchange, brought it to the surface where he could witness it and tend it like a fire. Yet the field never let him forget that there was a next step, a next measure, a broader circle that could be drawn in the dark with a steady hand. The day the goats were gone and the chickens reduced to silence, he stood at the edge of the road and watched the heat shiver above the clay. In the distance, a figure moved slowly toward the town, a man with a bundle across his shoulder and a limp that seemed to pull the ground closer with every step. There were others on the road now, thin men in worn coats, faces set toward nowhere, the gray of the past still clinging to them like dust that no water could wash away. The farmer felt the field behind him as one feels the presence of a listener. Leaning close, he did not speak aloud. He did not need to. He understood that the barrel would never again be full enough, and that the bowl in the kitchen would never again be heavy enough unless he learned to invite a different kind of offering. The road would bring him what the earth asked for, and when it did, he would open his door. The roads of Alabama in 1872 were haunted by men who no longer belonged anywhere. They drifted like ashes carried on the wind, soldiers stripped of uniforms but not of memory, their bodies marked by scars that told stories no one cared to hear. Some wore boots worn through at the sole, others dragged themselves barefoot across the red clay, their eyes hollow, their cheeks gaunt. Hunger drove them from one farmstead to the next, offering labor for a meal, promising work in exchange for shelter. But most doors stayed closed, for in those years of ruin, no family could spare a scrap for a stranger. The land had been bled dry by war, and every mouth was a burden too heavy to feed. Yet on the outskirts of one town, there was a door that opened. The farmer began to notice them first as shadows on the horizon, figures limping along the dusty road, their heads bowed, their steps unsteady. When one passed by, he would raise a hand in silent invitation. The wanderer, startled by the rare gesture of kindness, would approach. He was always offered bread, sometimes meat, and water drawn cold from the pump. The farmer's face remained unreadable, his voice low, but his hospitality was undeniable. To a starving man, suspicion dies quickly in the presence of food. They accepted. They stayed the night, and in the morning, they were gone. The townsfolk thought little of it at first. Strangers came and went constantly in those days, men chasing. Rumors of work, Men running from debts, men with no future at all. To disappear was natural. A drifter who failed to arrive at the next town would simply be forgotten. But the pattern grew. Too many passed the farmer's gate and never came out the other side. Too many shadows dissolved into the soil around his home. Those who watched from a distance swore they saw lantern light moving across his fields at midnight, bobbing among the corn as if guided by a hand both careful and deliberate. And always, in the days that followed, his crops stood greener, fuller, and unnaturally alive. The farmer did not act with malice, or at least not in the way ordinary men understand it. When he carried a plate of food to the weary traveler, when he guided him to the small cot in the corner of his house, there was no cruelty in his gestures. But he felt the field behind him, leaning in, listening, waiting. The soil had grown, restless with animal offerings, and he knew the time had come to feed it something more. He did not think of it as murder. He thought of it as trade, as balance, as continuation. The world had taken his wife, had taken his peace, had taken everything that once tethered him to the realm of men. The earth was the only companion left to him, and when it asked, he obeyed. Those who lived closest to his land began to whisper of strange sounds that carried on the wind. Sometimes it was the moan of a man, low and broken, fading as if pulled into the depths of the ground. Other nights it was a sudden cry, sharp and short, cut off before it could echo. Dogs in the neighboring farms howled without reason, their eyes fixed on the direction of the farmer's fields. Once during a storm, a woman swore she saw him dragging a heavy sack across the mud, the contents shifting as though alive. Lightning illuminated the scene for a heartbeat, and then it was swallowed by darkness. The disappearances did not go unnoticed forever. Men in town began to speak of them over weak whiskey in the tavern, their voices hushed but urgent. They counted the faces of those who had passed through and failed to return. One remembered a soldier with a limp and a scar down his jaw. Another recalled a man with a broken rifle strapped to his back. None of them had been seen again. Still, no one dared accuse the farmer directly. Hunger was stronger than suspicion. His grain filled their tables. His corn sweetened their meals. To question him would mean cutting themselves off from the only abundance left in that cursed year. So they swallowed their fear and told themselves that the road was dangerous, that men vanished all the time. But the land itself told another story. In the mornings when the mist clung to the earth, some swore they saw shapes moving just beneath the surface of his fields, as if the soil was not soil at all, but a skin stretched tight over something that shifted and writhed below. One boy, daring beyond his years, claimed he crept near at night and saw the farmer kneeling in the rows, his hands buried wrist deep in the dirt. The boy swore that the man's lips were moving, not in prayer but in conversation, and that the earth answered back with a shudder that made the stalks tremble though the air was still. The boy's father beat him for lying, but the boy never walked near that land again. As summer deepened into autumn, the whispers thickened. The farmer's land was too rich, his silence too heavy, his generosity too strange. There was something unnatural about his prosperity, something that gnawed at the edges of every whispered conversation in the town. But still, no one acted. Fear and hunger bound them in silence. And all the while, the farmer continued to open his door to those weary wanderers who walked the lonely road, feeding them, welcoming them, and then offering them to the earth that demanded their blood. Night in that ruined county did not fall. It gathered. It came like a slow tide that rose without sound, filling every hollow and rafter, until even the breath inside a house seemed borrowed from older darkness. On the farmer's land, the night had a second life, a patient voice that spoke from leaf and root. When the lantern was lit and the small yellow flame cupped in his palm, the rose accepted him as if he were a priest returning to a chapel that had been waiting all day. The first steps into the corn were always the same. A hush spread, outward, softer than the stir of moth wings, and the leaves brushed his sleeves with a touch that felt almost deliberate. A mile away, a dog would bark once and then think better of it. Closer by, the frogs fell quiet, He lifted the wooden bowl, and the smell of iron climbed into the warm air, sweet and metallic and strangely clean, and the soil under his boots seemed to shift its weight the way a body does before it speaks. Sometimes the sky was clear, and the moon rode high with a pale rim like ground bone. On those nights the field glowed faintly, not with light but with a held breath, a readiness that made the hairs along his forearms lift in greeting. Other nights the clouds pressed low and a wet mist walked among the stalks, beating on his lantern, glass hanging from the tassels like a rosary of cold drops. The farmer learned the moods of the field the way a widower learns the moods of memory. He knew where the rows narrowed and where the earth bulged, as if something underneath had turned in its sleep. He knew that if he stood very still at the center and closed his eyes, he could feel a slow rhythm rise through his boots and into his bones, a steady thump that was not his own pulse, a cadence that seemed older than the town and the war, and every crooked fence ever nailed into the clay. Those who lived near enough to hear the world breathe swore that midnight changed the rules. A neighbor fetching water once dropped her pail and ran when a murmur drifted over the fence, the sort of murmur a mother makes when she rocks a feverish child. A boy who had sworn he would never go near that land again woke from a dream of tall green corridors to the sound of a man speaking in a voice low and even, a voice that never rose above a whisper, a voice that made the boy think of prayer and bargaining at the same time. On storm nights the field seemed to rise toward the lightning, and in those white flashes the corn cast shadows that moved the wrong way, as if they were not thrown by the lantern or the moon at all, but by something lit from within the ground. After the thunder rolled away, a thin cry sometimes leaped up and was cut short, and then the leaves rubbed together quickly like hands trying to warm themselves. The farmer told himself that the field was merely alive in the way all good fields are alive. He told himself that roots creep and soil settles, and that night exaggerates every sound it is given. But the signs multiplied in directions that pointed to a deeper truth. Dew on his land tasted faintly of iron. The wind at the edge of the rows curled back on itself as if it had met a wall where no wall stood. Once he pressed his palm to the ground and felt something pass beneath. Not a mole or snake, but a looser movement. A redistribution like breath taken and released by a great lung buried just under the furrows. When he lifted his hand, the print filled slowly, not with water, but with a darker moisture that left a stain on his skin that did not wash away for 3 days. There were nights when he did not carry the bowl. He went empty-handed, only to listen, only to learn what the field would do without him. He found that the leaves conversed in dry syllables when the air was cool, and that the tassels answered like 100 small mouths humming a single note. He found that footprints took longer to fade than they should, that anything dropped into the furrows disappeared with unnerving speed, swallowed by a settling that looked like ordinary gravity but felt like appetite. The lantern behaved oddly, too. Its flame leaned toward the ground when he stood in certain places, as if a draft rose from the soil itself, a slow current drawing heat downward where heat should not go. He would stand there with the lantern held low and feel the warmth pulled from his knuckles, feel the pull grow stronger until his breath shortened and his chest hummed with that borrowed rhythm, and then he would step back and the pull would ease, and the flame would right itself with a small triumphant wag. Word of these nights traveled without the help of mouths. Men who slept lightly woke uneasy, as if called by name from a distance that was not measured in miles. Women sat up in bed and pressed palms to their sternums, sensing a drum that did not belong to them. The faithful who had not missed a Sunday in 20 years found themselves staring at the church door without the will to enter, suddenly aware that the scripture they needed now might be the kind that requires soil and silence rather than pew and sermon. By day, they argued against their fear. By night, they yielded to it. One man took a shortcut across a corner of the farmer's land in the blue hour before dawn and came home with his boots stained a color that was not mud. He burned them in the yard and would not say why. The field did not only speak, it watched. The sense of eyes without pupils rode the wind like pollen, light and inescapable. Standing at the fence, a person felt counted, weighed, inventoried. The farmer himself felt it most clearly. When he rose from sleep, already certain of the weather before he looked at the sky, he understood that the field had pressed its forecast against his dreams. He walked with a new confidence that made his shoulders square and his back straight, the carriage of a man who receives letters from an authority older than the county judge. He began to answer aloud when the leaves rubbed together in their quick whisper, began to reply to that low underfoot cadence, with promises he no longer bothered to dress as prayers. He was not alone, and he had not been for some time. Yet night gives as much as it takes. The crops thickened and sweetened under its attention. The corn ears grew heavy enough to bow the stalks, and the wheat heads ripened into a color that looked like late afternoon even at noon. The farmer brought baskets into town and set them quietly where hands could reach them. Hunger softened suspicion every time. Men who had told themselves that they would ask hard questions found their mouths full of warm bread before the question could shape itself. Mothers who had sworn to stay away sent children to fetch flour, and when those children returned with cheeks flushed from running and crumbs around their lips, the resolve melted like fat in a hot pan. As the nights grew stranger, the days grew kinder, and the town learned to accept the bargain without yet naming it. From the porches and narrow lanes, people watched the edge of the farmer's land at dusk, then turned their faces toward their own tables when the first stars appeared. They did not want to see lantern light moving among the rows. They did not want to hear the far-off murmur that shaped itself like comfort and warning at once. They wanted to live, and living required bread, and bread required silence. In that silence, the field swelled and the farmer's steps grew sure, and the town drifted inch by inch toward a choice that felt less like a decision and more like a tide. When the next figure came down the road with a bag over his shoulder and a limp that would carry him to the gate just as the moon rose, no one looked long enough to recognize his face. They were already turning inward, already practicing the quiet that would become their only defense. By the time autumn arrived, the town had begun to understand the shape of its own silence. The farmers' fields, impossibly green and gold, were no longer merely a curiosity. They had become the town's lifeline, the one place where hunger could be held at bay. The crops from other farms faltered, their stalks thin, their yields meager. Families rationed what little they had, mothers cutting bread so thin it curled like parchment, children gnawing on roots pulled from the edge of ditches. But when the farmer came down the road with baskets of corn, sacks of wheat, or jars of flour, there was a shift in the air. Faces softened, voices quieted. Questions that had sharpened themselves in the restless dark of night dulled to nothing. In the brightness of day, no one wanted to ask where his bounty came from. At first, his offerings were modest, the surplus of a fortunate harvest. A basket placed at the church door, a sack of grain left at the tavern. He asked for nothing in return. The preacher spoke of him as an instrument of providence, a reminder that God still provided for the faithful even in hard years. But not all were so eager to call it divine. Behind closed doors, when oil lamps flickered low, the whispers grew sharper. Too many strangers had vanished. Too many lights had been seen at night moving across his fields. Some swore they had heard voices carried on the wind, screams swallowed by the earth, sobs hidden within the rustling of corn. Yet when morning came and the hunger gnawed at their stomachs, those same whisperers took the bread, baked it, and fed it to their children. The truth was simple and cruel. They needed him. The farmer did not need the town, but the town could not survive without his fields. This imbalance weighed heavy on their hearts, and so they struck an unspoken bargain. No one spoke of the disappearances aloud. No one asked why his crops thrived when theirs died. No one crossed the fence after sundown. In return, his bounty continued to find its way to their tables. It was not written, nor agreed upon in words, but every man and woman felt the pack settle upon them like a second skin. They avoided his eyes when he came to town, their thanks muttered quickly, their faces turning away as if in shame. Yet in their silence was a kind of worship, a bowing, of heads before a power they dared not confront. Children, too, felt the weight of it. They were warned not to wander near the farmer's land, not to peer through the crooked fences, not to follow the lantern light that sometimes glimmered between the rows after dark. But children are drawn to what frightens them. They dared one another to touch the soil at the edge of the field, to pluck a single leaf and bring it back as proof. One boy returned, pale and trembling, clutching not a leaf, but a kernel of corn that dripped with something thick and red. His mother burned it in the hearth and forbade him from ever speaking of it again. When other children asked what he had seen, he simply shook his head and wept. And that silence was a warning stronger than any words. There were those who considered breaking the pact. A group of men once whispered over drink that they should ride out together, confront the farmer, and put an end to whatever darkness he had bound himself to. But even as the words left their mouths, they faltered. Each remembered the taste of his bread, the strength it had given them when their own fields had failed. Each remembered their wives and children, faces drawn thin with hunger, bellies growling in the night. They could not bring themselves to cut off the one supply of life that kept their families breathing. And so the talk dissolved, and the pact held. The farmer himself seemed to understand the bargain, though he never spoke of it. His silence was its own language, an acknowledgement that the town would not question him so long as he continued to feed them. When he came into town, he moved quietly, his steps steady, his eyes unreadable. He never lingered, never asked for thanks. He would set down what he carried and leave as though the exchange required no words at all, and indeed, it did not. The silence between him and the town was the loudest truth of all. But silence is a fragile thing. It can stretch only so far before it begins to tear. And as the year drew toward its end, the hunger of the field grew deeper, hungrier, more insistent. Animals were gone, travelers were gone, and still the soil demanded more. It was not long before the pact was tested in the most brutal way possible, for the earth had grown accustomed to blood, and it no longer cared if that blood came from strangers or from those the town held dear. It began with a boy of no more than 10, the son of a neighboring farmer whose land lay thin and barren. He had been sent out at dusk with a wooden bucket to fetch water from the creek that wound its way just beyond the line of cornfields. His father watched him go, saw the small shape of his son's shoulders against the dimming sky, and thought nothing of it. But when the sun sank and the bucket did not return, a chill spread across the yard. The father called his name into the gathering dark, his voice breaking into echoes that carried no answer. By morning, the boy was still gone. The only trace of him was the bucket, lying on its side at the edge of the farmer's land, the bottom stained with a dark smear that was not water. At first, the town told themselves the boy had wandered too far, that wolves or snakes had taken him, that he had stumbled and drowned in the creek. But the whispers began almost immediately. Too close, they said. He had vanished too close to the field that never failed. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Fathers walked them home from chores that once required no escort. Yet still, hunger gnawed, and the silence held. The next to vanish was a girl, older by a few years, known for her boldness. She was last seen walking near the fence line at dusk, chasing after a ball of yarn that had rolled from her basket. Her younger sister swore she had watched her step between the posts, her braids swinging against her back as she bent to pick it up. But she never came out again. The family tore through the corn that night, lanterns swinging wildly, voices crying out until they cracked. The stalks shivered in the windless dark, whispering against each other like mocking laughter. No sign of the girl was ever found. The town could no longer ignore the pattern. Travelers and drifters were one thing. They were nameless, rootless, easily forgotten. But children were another matter. Their absence left hollows too deep, their silence rang too loudly in the homes they had filled with noise. Mothers wailed in the church, demanding answers. Fathers sharpened axes and cleaned rust from long-forgotten rifles. For the first time, voices rose against the farmer in daylight. They spoke of curses, of evil bargains, of land that had been fed with too much death. They remembered the nights when they had heard cries carried on the wind, and asked themselves whether they had mistaken warnings for dreams. Yet when they gathered their anger, it faltered against the weight of hunger. The farmer's bread still filled their tables. His corn still boiled in their pots. His wheat still rose as the only promise of winter survival. They could not bring themselves to sever the tie completely, not yet. And so the silence returned, though now it trembled, thinner than before. They told themselves the children might still be found, that perhaps the field had not claimed them, that perhaps the earth was not as cruel as it seemed. They lied to themselves because the truth was too sharp to face. But the children were not silent, not entirely. On stormy nights when the wind swept through the rows of corn, families swore they heard their voices, high and fragile, carried on the rushing air. The cries of the lost echoed as though trapped in the stalks themselves. Some claimed to hear laughter twisted into sobbing, others the desperate call of names, mothers, fathers, woven into the wind before fading into silence. No one dared follow those voices into the dark. The field had grown too alive, too watchful, too eager to swallow those who lingered at its edge. For the farmer, there was no guilt. He walked the rows at night with his lantern, carrying the small offerings as he always had. The soil trembled with delight when it drank, the stalks bowing slightly as though in gratitude. He whispered promises, the same as before, but now with a fervor that bordered on devotion. In his mind, the children were not lost. They were given. They had become part of the field, their lives woven into the endless green, their breath transformed into the strength of the harvest. He no longer saw himself as a man alone in the world, but as the keeper of something eternal, something that listened, something that answered. The town, however, had reached a breaking point. They could ignore drifters. They could excuse whispers in the night, but they could not forgive the loss of their own flesh and blood. Something would have to be done. And as the storms of autumn grew louder, so too did the voices of men who gathered in the tavern, their fists tightening around glasses as they swore that the time for silence had ended. It was a night heavy with storm, the kind where the sky swelled black and restless, and thunder rolled like artillery across the hills. Rain had not yet fallen, but the air carried that damp weight that makes the skin prickle and the hair rise. It was on such a night that the men of the town gathered, their patience broken, their silence frayed to the point of snapping. They met first in whispers, then in mutters, and finally in oaths spoken aloud over bottles of whiskey. The missing, children, the screams carried on the wind, the strange bounty of the farmer's land, all of it had built to this moment. Their hunger no longer outweighed their fear. Something had to be done. There were 7 of them that night, farmers and laborers, their faces gaunt, their eyes sharpened by grief and drink. Each carried what weapon he could find. 2 had rifles, long unused, barrels cleaned with oil that smelled sharp in the storm air. 1 carried an axe dulled from splitting wood, another a hunting knife strapped to his belt. The others held shotguns, their stocks cracked but still functional. Lanterns, swung in their free hands, the flames bending and flickering with each gust of wind. They did not speak as they walked the road toward the farmer's land. Silence was their only courage. The closer they came, the heavier the air grew. The fields loomed ahead, their stalks dark silhouettes against the trembling sky. Lightning split the clouds, illuminating the corn in brief flashes of silver. And in those moments the men swore the stalks leaned toward them, as if listening. They reached the sagging fence line, the crooked posts like ribs of a long-dead animal, and climbed over. The soil beneath their boots was soft, almost wet, though it had not rained for weeks. Each step sank deeper than it should, the earth clutching at their heels. Still, they pressed forward, the lanterns casting sickly light on the rows that stretched endlessly before them. When they reached the farmhouse, they found it silent. The shutters clattered softly against the wind. The door swung slightly ajar, its hinges groaning. 1 man, the youngest of the group, whispered that they should turn back, that something was wrong, too wrong, that no good could come from crossing that threshold. But the others pressed him on, and together they stepped into the darkness of the house. The air inside was stale, heavy with a smell they could not name, something between rust and rot, sharp enough to sting the nose. The rooms were bare, stripped of comfort, stripped even of necessity. A table stood in the center, scarred by years of use, and upon it rested a wooden bowl. In the weak light of their lanterns, they saw it was filled not with water, not with food, but with something thick and clotted, black in the dimness yet shining red when lightning lit the room. A murmur rippled through the men. Some stepped back, crossing themselves. Others clenched their weapons tighter, their resolve turning from fear to rage. They searched the house, calling the farmer's name, but found no sign of him. The bed was stripped, the cupboards empty, the hearth cold. It was as if he had abandoned the place, leaving only that bowl as a mark of his presence. But before they could question further, a sound rose from outside, a low, steady groan, not of wind, not of storm, but of something alive. The men rushed to the doorway, lanterns lifted high, and what they saw froze them where they stood. The field was moving. The rows of corn swayed, though no wind touched them, their stalks bending in rhythm, as though breathing together. The earth itself rippled, small mounds rising and falling like waves on a black sea. Then came the sound, muffled at first, then clearer. Cries, human cries, the voices of men and women, the voices of children, all tangled together in a chorus of agony rising from beneath the soil. The lanterns shook in their hands, and one man dropped his, the flame sputtering out as it hit the ground. They had only a moment to react before the earth claimed one of them. The man with the axe screamed as the soil at his feet split open, roots slick and sinewy bursting forth like serpents. They coiled around his ankles, tightening with impossible strength, dragging him down into the dirt. He swung his axe wildly, cutting at the roots, but for every one severed, two more took its place. The others rushed forward, trying to pull him free, but the soil swallowed him up to his knees, then his waist. His scream rose into the storm and was silenced in an instant as the earth closed over his head, leaving nothing but a trembling lantern, lying in the mud where he had stood. Panic broke them. The men scattered, some fleeing back toward the road, others frozen in terror, their lanterns swinging wildly as shadows leapt across the stalks. The ground shifted under their feet, rising and falling as though something massive turned in the depths below. The cries of the lost rose louder, filling the air until it seemed the storm itself was wailing. One man fired his rifle blindly into the soil, the sound cracking like thunder, but the shot vanished into the dark without answer. Another dropped to his knees, praying aloud, his words choked by sobs. Those who escaped would never forget that night. They fled into the storm, abandoning lanterns, abandoning weapons, abandoning the pact of silence they had sworn. They returned to town with faces pale as ash, their voices trembling as they told what they had seen. Some refused to believe them, others believed too much. But none dared return to the farmer's land. The house stood empty, the fields alive, the earth restless with hunger. And somewhere within it the farmer remained, whether as master or as victim, no one could say. The morning after the storm, when the men who had fled staggered back into town with hollow eyes and trembling hands, there were those who doubted their story. Drink had been involved after all, and fear has a way of weaving nightmares into truth. But when the others, those who could not sleep for dread of what had been told, mustered the courage to ride out and see the farmer's land with their own eyes, they found the house exactly as described. Silent, stripped bare, abandoned. The shutters swung loosely in the damp wind. The porch sagged with rot, and the door still hung crooked on its hinges as though left open in haste. Inside, the air was thick with a smell that clung to the throat and stung the eyes. It was not the simple stench of rot, nor the musk of mold from long neglect. It was sharper, richer, metallic. The smell of iron mingled with earth, the smell of blood. Dust lay over everything, yet there were no signs of struggle, no scattered belongings, no overturned furniture. It was as if the farmer had walked out one night and never returned, his life erased as cleanly as chalk wiped from a board. Only one thing remained, waiting like a message left for those who dared enter. On the table sat the wooden bowl, It was not large, not ornate. A simple thing, carved long ago, its edges smoothed by years of use. Yet what it held made the strongest. Men draw back in revulsion. The liquid inside was dark and congealed, thick as tar, its surface clotting in ridges and cracks. In the pale light seeping through the broken shutters, it appeared almost black. But when a lantern was raised and the flame leaned over it, the surface gleamed red, like fresh wounds that had never fully healed. A sour tang rose from it, heavy, with iron and decay. One man swore he saw it ripple faintly, as though stirred by something beneath its surface, though no breath of wind touched it. They stood around the table in silence, the weight of the object pressing on them like judgment. It was not simply a vessel, it was an altar. The bowl had witnessed every offering, had carried the lifeblood of animals, of drifters, of children. It was the one thing the farmer had chosen to leave behind, as though it were the key to his secret, the heart of his covenant with the land. Some argued they should smash it, burn it, purge it from existence. Others whispered that to destroy it might invite wrath far worse than what they had already suffered. In the end, none dared touch it. The bowl remained, glistening in the half-light, patient as the soil itself. Searching the rest of the house brought no comfort. The bed was stripped bare, its mattress nothing but sagging fabric, as though never slept in. The hearth was cold, ashes scattered thin as if the last fire had burned out weeks ago. In the cupboard lay no food, no utensils, nothing to suggest a life still lived. But in the smokehouse they found barrels stained dark at the bottom, salt clinging in crusts along the wood. The smell of old blood seeped from the cracks, faint but unmistakable. It was proof enough for the men, though none spoke the words aloud. They left quickly, each turning their back on the farmhouse with relief, as if afraid the walls themselves might close in around them. It was when they stepped back outside that the fear rooted deeper. For the fields, though battered by the storm, stood taller than ever. The corn gleamed wet with rain, their stalks bending under the weight of ears swollen full. The wheat swayed as though no storm had touched it, each stalk upright, unbroken, shining gold against the gray sky. Yet the soil between the rows was black, not with water but with something thicker, something that clung to boots and hands like Eureka. And when the wind moved, faint cries drifted from the stalks. A child's whimper, a man's groan. The echo of voices swallowed whole. The men froze, their lanterns trembling. Then, as if to remind them of their place, the earth shifted. Underfoot, a slow settling that sent shudders up their spines. They fled without a word, not daring to look back until the town's rooftops rose in sight. In the weeks that followed, no one returned to the farm. The bowl remained, the house remained, the fields thrived untouched. The people of the town lived, with a new silence deeper and more dreadful than before. They no longer whispered of the farmer or his bargains. They no longer prayed for the children or spoke of the cries heard in the night. They simply avoided the subject altogether, as if silence itself were a shield. But silence cannot bury truth. The field still grew, the soil still pulsed, and the bowl still waited on that table, patient as stone, glistening red in the dark. The farmer's land was abandoned in name only. Though the house stood empty and the man himself was never seen again, the fields refused to wither. If anything, they grew stronger in his absence. Corn rose higher than a man could reach, its stalks thick as fence posts, its leaves so broad they clattered against each other like the sound of blades in a crowded hall. The wheat shimmered gold under every hour of light, bending but never, breaking in storm or drought, and the soil, black and wet, held a sheen that never dried, as though it had drunk something richer than rain. At first, the town avoided it entirely. No one dared cross the sagging fence. No one dared touch the crops. But hunger gnawed, and memory is a weak barrier against the growl of an empty stomach. A few brave or desperate men crept to the edge of the field at night, cutting down ears of corn and sheaves of wheat. They returned to town pale and trembling, swearing the earth had shifted beneath their feet, that whispers followed them between the rows. Yet when they baked bread from that grain, It was the finest they had ever tasted. Sweet, full, nourishing in a way that felt unnatural. Families ate, and the fear eased. Soon others followed, slipping into the field at dusk, gathering what they could. But each who entered returned with the same haunted look, their hands trembling as though they had touched something alive. It was not long before the field demanded payment for their theft. One man, strong and broad, ventured too far into the rows, seeking to cut more than his share. His wife waited all night for his return, only to find his sickle abandoned at the fence, its blade slick with something dark. Another family lost their eldest son, who had gone to fetch a bundle of wheat and never returned. His brothers claimed to hear him crying for help, his voice muffled, carried on the wind between the stalks. But when they followed it, the sound sank beneath the soil and was gone. The ground was disturbed where he had stood, as if something had pulled him under. They dug until their hands bled but found nothing. The stories multiplied. Those who entered the field spoke of roots that shifted like serpents, wrapping around boots, tugging at ankles. Some swore they felt hands beneath the soil, grasping, pulling, clutching at them with desperate strength. Others claimed the cries were not only of the lost, but also of the farmer himself, his voice woven into the chorus, calling them by name, urging them to step deeper into the rows. Lanterns failed without reason, flames snuffed out by drafts that rose from the ground itself. More than one man staggered back over the fence with his hair turned white, his eyes fixed on something none of the others could see. What terrified them most was the discovery that the field did not merely devour, it remembered. A woman gathering, Horn swore she heard her lost child's voice call her from between the stalks, sweet and familiar, just as it had sounded when he played outside her door. She dropped her bundle and rushed forward, ignoring the cries of her companions. They found her bonnet near the fence the next morning, but of her there was no trace. Another man heard his brother's voice begging for help, and when he stepped into the rows, he felt arms embrace him before the soil dragged him down. The field lured them, using the voices of those it had already claimed, weaving memory and hunger together until the living could not resist. The townsfolk tried fire. One night they carried torches to the edge of the land, determined to burn it all away. Flames touched the outer rows, crackling up the stalks, but the fire would not spread. The corn smoked and hissed as though wet, the soil releasing a stench of iron and rot. Then came a sound, a deep groan from beneath, rolling through the earth like the breath of some buried giant. The ground trembled, and the men fled before it could open beneath them. By dawn, the burned stalks had already regrown, standing tall and green as though nothing had touched them. The field could not be destroyed, it could only be avoided, and so it was that the land became a boundary, a place marked on every mind as cursed, a wound in the earth that would never heal. Yet even as they swore to keep away, the hunger of the town remained. Some continued to risk the field in secret, drawn to the unnatural bounty it offered. Each who entered believed they could take without being taken, believed they could outwit the soil. But the field was patient. It had learned to devour slowly, to whisper sweetly, to wait until the moment when even the strongest spirit wavered, and one by one, it claimed them. In time, the people stopped counting the missing. It was easier not to. The field had become its own mouth, wide and waiting, and those who stepped inside were simply swallowed by history. The town shrank, its streets emptier with each passing year, but the field never faltered. It remained as it had since that first bowl of blood touched its soil, alive, awake, and endlessly hungry. Years passed, and the town around the farmer's land withered like a plant cut from its roots. Families moved away, following rail lines north or west in search of hope the soil no longer offered. Some left under cover of night, abandoning homes they could no longer bear to inhabit, haunted by the memory of children who had vanished into the earth. Others stayed until hunger or despair broke them, their names lost to church registers that gathered dust in a crumbling chapel. What remained were empty houses sagging into the ground, fences leaning like broken ribs, and at the center of it all, the farm that refused to die. The farmhouse itself collapsed by degrees, its roof caving inward, its timbers rotting into heaps of gray wood. The windows shattered, the porch sagged into the mud, and the walls became nothing more than a skeleton of boards rattling in the wind. Yet the field endured, as though untouched by time. Each spring it rose again, stalks green and thick, leaves cutting sharp as knives in the wind. Each summer it gleamed gold and lush, indifferent to drought or flood. Even in winter, when other fields lay bare and skeletal, faint shoots clung to its soil, whispering with a life that refused to fade. Travelers who came upon it by chance would pause at its edges, unsettled by its impossible vitality, their instincts warning them to turn away. And those who ignored those instincts rarely returned. The legends began to grow. Mothers warned their children never to stray near the old farm, never to follow the sound of laughter in the wind, never to listen when the field called their names. Men sitting around campfires spoke of the cries that still rose from the soil during storms, of faces glimpsed in the stalks just before lightning split the sky. Some swore the farmer himself still walked among the rows, his lantern bobbing faintly. In the dark, his figure bending to tend the soil as if he had never left. Others believed he had become part of the field, his body long devoured, his voice woven into the chorus of the lost, guiding the roots with whispers no living ear could hear. It became a place of testing for the reckless and the young. Boys dared each other to touch the soil inside the fence, to pluck a single leaf and bring it back as proof of their courage. Some returned pale and trembling, their hair damp with sweat though the night was cold. Others returned changed in subtler ways, their eyes hollow, their laughter brittle, as if part of them had remained behind among the stalks. A few never returned at all. The town buried those stories alongside the missing, adding them to the silence that had become tradition. The generations that followed carried the tale forward, reshaping it in fragments, but never losing its core. They spoke of a farm fed with blood, of a man who had made a bargain with the earth, of a field that grew fat on life and never let go. Some said the land itself had been cursed long before the farmer came, that it had tasted too much death during the war and learned to hunger for it. Others said the farmer had called something forth, something that might have slept forever if not for his offerings. Whatever the truth, the land remained as it was, green, thriving, and wrong. Even now, when the town has dwindled to little more than a name on a map, the story persists. Hunters who stray too close swear they hear voices rising from the rows, sometimes weeping, sometimes singing, sometimes calling their names in tones so familiar it makes their blood run cold. Travelers who follow the back roads claim to see a faint light drifting in the distance, bobbing like a lantern carried by an unseen hand. And those who have dared to step closer tell of a steady thumping beneath their feet, like a heartbeat buried deep in the soil, reminding them that the earth does not forget what it has been fed. And so the tale of the farmer lives on, not written in books nor carved in stone, but carried in whispers passed from mouth to mouth, warning those who will listen. They say the land is still hungry, that it waits with patience older than memory, that it knows the taste of blood and will never settle for less. They say the field remembers every voice it has swallowed, every heart it has claimed, and that it will remember yours too if you stray too close. If you ever find yourself in Alabama, and you come upon a field that seems too green, too alive, standing proud while all else withers, you would do well to turn back. Do not press your ear to the ground. Do not follow the sound of laughter in the wind. And above all, do not mistake silence for safety. For the earth remembers, and once you set foot in that soil, it may decide that your blood, too, is worth drinking.